folks. Thanks for tuning in to Season 2 of Food for Thought. I'm beyond excited to speak with our guest today, Calvin Raessler. Reason being, in Season 1, we shone a bright light on the plant-based protein space, and for good reason. Its adoption is skyrocketing with the present-day consumer. However, there's another side to the protein coin, that being animal-based protein. Our goal on Food for Thought is not to impart bias, but to shine a light on all parts of the food system that matter. For us, that's product development, the other being sustainable protein development, all under the umbrella of better for you food. Today's conversation matters. It matters for so many reasons, one of which being to understand the nuances of how cattle can be raised in a sustainable manner that actually benefits the environment, not works against it. Calvin shines a light on all things sustainable protein development, regenerative agricultural practices, and a unique symbiotic relationship Topgrass cattle has with the beer industry. Let's dive in. Calvin, where does Food for Thought find you today?
It finds me in my office in sunny Alberta near Calgary.
Beautiful. And tell the listeners all about Topgrass Cattle Company.
Wow. Where should I start? I guess, it really starts from the beginning. I mean, I grew up on a small mixed farm in central Alberta where we had livestock and grain. And, as I got older, we spent more time focusing on grain. And through the 80s, it was a pretty tough environment at that point in time. And we just had to kind of pull up a ship and get out of the business to some degree because grain prices dropped quite a bit. We had hail 3 years in a row. We also experienced drought, and then interest rates had gone up so much that we ended up losing a large portion of our farm at that point in time. So through the 80s, I mean, we had mostly grain, but I did start a small cattle herd at that time. And I always loved, working with the cattle, being involved on the farm. And I went to the city to get a job. And I got a job in the city and would work during the week there. And then I would come out to the farm on the weekends, working with the cattle to make sure that they're all taken care of throughout time. And then in 2004, I ended up buying my ranch. So my ranch is located just northeast of Drumheller at the base of the Handhills. It consists of mostly native grassland that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's a beautiful piece of property with rolling hills and big coulees and creeks and that. It had about 140 acres of cropland on it when I first got it. And then I have since put it back into forages or into grasses and that. But it wasn't until, in the mid 2000s that I really started thinking about doing something with selling beef. And in fact, in about 2004, I started selling beef to friends and family in the city. And this beef was grain fed. We confined the animals still, but we were selling a hormone-free and antibiotic-free beef and thought that we were doing a really, really good job. But during that time period, I was getting a lot of feedback from my customers and different people in the city that were stating that, cattle are bad for the environment, beef is unhealthy for you, basically, really giving me a punch in the gut saying that, what you're doing, Calvin, is really not that good. So it really drove me to question, what I was doing and if there was another way. And so I did learn a little bit about doing grass-fed model. And so I started to experiment with that in, 2007, 8, 9, in that area there. And in 2009, I ended up losing my job with a large corporation. Our head office was at Atlanta. They wanted me to move down to Atlanta. I didn't want to go. And then that company laid off 6,500 people due to the economic downturn of the market crash in 2008. And I was one of the fortunate people that got let go, which put me in a position to really rethink my future about what I wanted to do. And I looked at different businesses, but my heart, my passion was really working with the land, working with the livestock. And I thought, well, I'm going to explore this a little bit more on the grass-fed beef model and that. So I did a ton of research, on the internet, understanding grass-fed beef, how we could do it in Canada. And in 2012, I decided to jump in with both feet, and we started marketing grass-fed beef. And then in 2013 was our first retailer, and basically the rest is history.
That's fantastic. What a story. So for those that aren't familiar with Top Grass, so you raise grass-fed, grass-finished cattle that are raised without antibiotics, no added hormones, no animal byproducts or grain, and raised on free pastures without herbicides and pesticides. Is there any sort of statistic you could say of what percentage of meat at our local grocery store would be able to make all of these claims that you're able to do because of the way you raise your cattle in such a sustainable manner?
No, there's really a very, very small percentage. I mean, currently we're a niche market, raising our animals in this fashion and marketing them in the grocery stores this way at this point in time, anyhow.
So one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast was we've had lots of voices on the plant-based protein side of understanding this part of sustainable protein. And after getting to know you a little bit, was just drawn to your story and wanted to have someone on the other side of the equation help folks understand what goes into the steak that ends up on their plate, or the burger at their local bistro, whatever it might be. So all that said, grass-fed, grain-fed, that might seem obvious to a rancher of what that means, but what does that mean, to the, urban consumer that doesn't spend time on a farm and they're just trying to make more sustainable, healthy choices when they go to the grocery store or restaurant? What does grass-fed versus grain-fed actually mean in reality?
Okay. Well, I mean, other than the obvious that, our animals are grass-fed, grass-finished, meaning that they never get grain throughout their whole entire life. Whereas the grain-fed animals, they're usually given grain for the last portion of their life. And that varies, but it's for a considerable amount of time. And what it does is when the grain is introduced into the animal, it's not a natural part of their diet for the most part. It increases the acidity level, and as a result, it changes the composition of the meat. But there's so many factors that go into once the animal is taken out of a grass-fed diet perspective and moved into confinement into these feedlots. A lot of stress is added to those animals. They're confined close together. As a result, more antibiotics are given to these animals, and combination with the grain that's a little harder on the system, it's just a highly stressful diet for those animals. Whereas our model is basically we're looking to address animal welfare issues, environmental issues, and as a result becomes healthy for the consumer from a meat perspective. So from an animal welfare perspective, you're going to find our animals out on pasture, on range, expressing their true nature, which is grazing. They're able to live a healthy way of life and an extended length of life as a result of it. And then, a consumer would also, we've got consumers that choose for animal welfare, we've got consumers that choose for environmental reasons and for the health benefit reasons. And we probably can get more into that later on.
For sure. Is it common for cattle to be raised on grasslands, on a conventional farm at all, or whether those fields have been, used for farming and they might have had, lingering pesticides or herbicides? Like what is sort of typical for the, when a calf, their sort of lifespan?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many good ranchers and producers out there that start off raising these animals right. They're out on pastures and ranch lands very similar to the ones that we have, with clean water, fresh air, lots of forages and that. And most of the land that cattle are raised on are marginal land that you won't find crops and that kind of stuff on there. So most of that land isn't sprayed with pesticides and herbicides, at least when it starts. Everything changes once the animal goes to the feedlot, because at the feedlot, what has happened is these feedlots, collect all this grain, which is lots of times from land close by that has been farmed using chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, and all of that kind of stuff on the land to grow those crops. And as a result, that those cattle are exposed to more of that in a feedlot situation.
Okay, that makes sense. When doing my research, I read that grass-fed cattle typically take longer to reach market weight than grain-fed. Is that because grain-fed typically they'll use that to sort of fatten them up to market weight, whereas grass-fed, you're more creating leaner tissue, I guess, all the way up until sort of end of life?
Yeah, the whole reason why we started, many people started feeding grain is they want to shorten the time from birth to the time that they are harvested. And by adding grain to their diet, it's very, very high in energy, and it creates the animal to grow as fast as it possibly can, putting on muscle and also fat to finish up quickly. Whereas a grass-fed diet is lower in energy. It takes the animals a lot longer to grow out through their lifestyle. So for example, a lot of animals in a feedlot situation will be harvested anywhere from 13 months up to 30 months of age at the very latest. Whereas a grass-fed program, we don't start harvesting our animals until about 22 months, and then we'll go up to around 32 months of age. So it just takes us a little bit longer to get there for sure.
Okay, that helps. I guess that probably adds, costs to your side as the ranch, maintaining those cattle for a longer amount of time. And then that's sort of why folks might see a price increase at the grocery store for grass-fed than grain-fed. Is that a fair statement?
To some degree, yes. I mean, you do have a longer length of time, so you have more interest associated with carrying those cattle for a longer period of time, and there is a little bit extra cost associated with it. However, more and more producers are learning all the time how better to grow different forages, how to extend their growing season so that these forages don't have to be harvested, which cuts down on their fossil fuel and all their labor, all the machinery costs and things like that. So we're learning to manage these cattle better and better as time goes on through some of these different techniques. And as a result, we're bringing that cost down. I think, why the biggest reason why you see an increased price at the store is that we don't have economies of scale either. We're small producers, we're harvesting at a small facility. The costs for harvesting at those facilities are substantially higher than you are not shipping full truckloads of beef from one location to the other. And you start adding all of these things up, and those also contribute to the extra cost of the beef. But there are, a lot of, practices and things that we do have in our grass-fed model in terms of taking care of the environment, etc., that get added in there that cost the consumer more by the time it gets to their plate.
Okay, and I want to come back to this point on the whole sort of regenerative ag model and zero in on this,
Yeah.
but I have a couple other questions, specifically just, you mentioned forage. I noticed that there's a connection between your cattle ranch and the beer industry. Can you elaborate on what this is?
Okay, yeah. I mean, so what we do is in the wintertime, as you know, in Canada, we do not have a lot of grasses that the animals can forage. So what we do is we harvest these forages at their nutritional peak in the summertime, put them up into different formats like hay and silage and haylage, and we, check the nutritional composition of this, and then we will feed that to the animals out in large pastures where where they can still roam free, but they're getting all the nutritional value that they possibly can. Sometimes the the crop wasn't that great, or the forages weren't that great that summer, and we could use a little bit of extra energy. So we found that malt sprouts work really well for feeding our animals. And how that works is that grain is taken to a malter, and they add moisture to it, and they sprout that grain. And there's something, and I don't know all the details, Mike, about the benefits of it, but they sprout that grain, and I think it changes an enzyme in the seed itself that makes it great for malting and making beer. That sprout that is growing is separated, dried, and that's what we will use as another kind of energy source for our animals in the cold winters. Those malt sprouts are, so imagine them like, going to your grocery store or going to your health food store, you'll see those greens or sprouts that you'll see right there. That's exactly what we're harvesting there, is that top forage portion, green portion of that. And that's what we're feeding to these animals. So yeah, works out good for the beer industry, and it works out great for us. And I think beer and steak go together well.
They certainly do. That's a really interesting example that I don't think many people would, be cognizant of, that there's connection between these sort of different industries that are very, agriculturally, rooted in, but something that there's sort of this hybrid connection and they can mutually benefit from one another. That's a really interesting example that I'm sure not many people listening would be familiar with. So maybe this is a good segue to kind of, opening the kimono a little bit on regenerative agricultural practices that, you've been incorporating into your operation. So maybe if you can kind of just on an overarching talk about what that, regenerative ag practices means to you. And then I kind of have some subsequent questions to that, but just, what you've been doing with Topgrass.
Okay. Yeah, I think, more and more people are hearing all about regenerative agricultural practices, and regenerative ag is becoming more popular and more of a buzzword out there. Really, what it is going beyond what we talk about in terms of sustainability. Regenerative is really about focusing on the soil. That's what it's all about. So healthy soil functions as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And through generative agriculture, we manage our lands to provide habitat for soil microbes to flourish and diversify to keep the ecosystem properly working. So as a result, healthy soils provide us with clean air, water, productive grazing lands, diverse wildlife, beautiful landscapes for many generations to come. And livestock just becomes an important tool on how to manage that grass and to recycle the nutrients and the carbon back into the soil as a result of it. So maybe I'll give you an example of something that we do specifically on our ranch.
Sure.
We try to get back, it's, more about working with nature than anything is what we're trying to do, instead of fight against nature. And we take more of a holistic approach as opposed to something more specific. And what I mean by that is, before we came into the picture as human beings, there was thousands and thousands and thousands of ruminants on this land prior to us. So for example, the bison, they used to run all across the prairies, and how they would move across is that they basically were driven by predators. And these predators kept the herd nice and tight, close together, and they would keep on the move constantly. So they would come in to an area that had nice grass. They would eat a portion of that grass. They would stamp and trample a bit of that grass. They would lay down on that grass. They would urinate, defecate on that grass. And then they would move on by nature to fresh green grass in a new area that they could graze on, leaving those grasses that was back there time to recover. So all those, the remaining leaves and that kind of stuff acts as solar panels, collects, solar rays, regenerates itself, and then that grass grows back up again. So what we've done on our ranch to try to mimic this behavior as much as we possibly can is we have divided our ranch into 34 different paddocks. And so we move the cattle from one paddock to the next in a large herd, doing the same type of things that those bison did. As a result, we're able to grow more grass than we ever grew before and sequester more carbon back into the soil. Then this is a change from how things have been done in the last few years. Most of the land and the ranch lands and that have been continuous grazed, meaning the rancher will turn their animals out onto a parcel of land. They'll leave them there for an extended period of time, but those animals keep going back to the same plants. And as soon as they start sprouting out, they'll start eating those down. And what it does is it takes away from the root structure of that plant. So imagine that for every amount of fiber that's above the top of the soil, that's how much root structure you would have below. And so if you have an animal that keeps going back to that same spot, eventually the roots get shallower and shallower and shallower. It's that root action that creates some microbiology in that soil. So if you've got, plants that all of a sudden are able to grow 3 feet tall and their root structure goes down equal to that or further, then you've got all of this root structure that's down there where all these microorganisms will be feeding on it when it dies and creating more plant food and, symbiotic relationships down there. And that's what we're looking to do in this other scenario, so that when the animals come in, they take a bite, they eat it once, they move on, and then they allow for that root structure to grow back up. And as a result, we get better filtration of the soil, so we don't lose as much moisture. I mean, all you have to do is go to some place and see where it has been packed down or it's been eaten down. The land will not absorb near the amount of moisture that my ranch land would be able to absorb and hold that moisture in there for future grass growth. So that's it in a nutshell. That's an example of a regenerative agricultural practice that we implement.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. That a newer, or what's, as much as it's new, it's actually going back to sort of ancient days of livestock management that's simulating the behavior of a wild herd to help restore grasslands and a more natural carbon water cycle, and to actually see that example of how that's working out. That's really fascinating. So in order to rotate your cattle through your grasslands, are there neighboring ranches or farms that are asking you, hey Calvin, can you move your herds through my field? Are people sort of still protective of that depending on the type of farm or ranch that they have? Or is it, do you see other people kind of looking over the fence and saying, oh, I like what Calvin's doing?
There's a huge movement moving more in this direction, and people are becoming more aware of it, so they're looking to implement it. What's really happened is that we have had a lot of our modern day agriculture requires a lot of high input costs, fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, etc., in order to manage these lands. And the more times you run machinery over them, the more fuel costs, the more machinery costs, the more labor costs, and all of that kind of stuff. But yet, like the price of cattle hasn't appreciated accordingly. So margins have been getting tighter. And so ranchers are looking for different ways to improve their bottom line. And this is something that's, been a growing movement in the agriculture community, I would say, over the last 8 years, and really is starting to get a foothold. There's a lot of seed companies that are promoting different kind of forages and brassicas, for annuals, but ideally pre-annuals is what we'd really like to have on the land all the time, so you don't have to run the machinery over, and they're constantly there, and they do the best job of sequestering carbon for sure. So there are more and more farmers and ranchers that are incorporating this. We're also seeing farmers that do a lot of cropland that are starting to implement some regenerative agricultural practices and involving livestock as a tool. So for example, before, most of the crops out there, and still are for the most part, are all monocultures. So you've got corn being seeded into the field, and that's all that's going to be harvested at that period of time, or barley or wheat, for example. Now, what some farmers are recognizing is that they can use what's called a cover crop, or underseed that crop with another one. Because the problem with, I talked about root structure and how that really contributes to the soil microbiology, and that the same exists on crop production. Our average crop is maybe only about 75 days growing during the summertime. So if you seeded in some barley, you would be harvesting that about 75 days later. After that, that is not growing anymore. There's no root activity that's happening whatsoever. But if you underseeded that with, let's say, Italian ryegrass, the Italian ryegrass would not take a foothold to begin with, and the grain would grow up first. The farmer would be able to harvest it or cut it down for silage and other feed. And then some of these other plants that they underseeded it with will continue to grow, and they can grow right up until the time of frost. So now, instead of having 75 days of just soil activity or root activity within the soil, now we've expanded that to 200. And there are brassicas, like turnip and rapeseed and things like that will grow right up to -8 degrees, in the fall time. So we're seeing that growth, and you go out there and be snow covered down on some of this, and still be nice and green under there. So we're learning so much more here in this last while, how to manage our soil a little bit better, understanding the microbiology of it, and incorporating a lot of these different techniques. So I think we're going to see more of this to come. But, it takes time, and we're so used to doing things a certain way. It takes a long time for farmers to make that shift, for sure.
Yeah, and I'm assuming, like, let's say in Alberta, where you've got pretty hard pan prairie ground, if you get a big rain, a lot of times it just sort of, depending, on the type of land, it'll just sort of run off because it doesn't absorb that much. But I would assume, based on sort of these practices you're talking about, the farmers, I mean, in a lot of parts of Alberta, I have family that ranches northeast of where you are.
Yeah.
Rain is at a premium. And so if you were able to capture more of that rain by maybe incorporating some of these ag practices, I have to think that would be a good idea. Obviously, there's some costs and time associated with maybe, shifting over to this model you're speaking of. But I've heard a lot of chatter about this in the US, and talking about monocultures and how the government, this is going back, I think, to the 1975, where they were incentivizing farmers to, do corn and soy and whatnot. But
right,
we had a guest, Robin O'Brien, on season 1, and she's very knowledgeable in this realm, but talking about how, the government needs to do things to maybe change the incentive structure for farmers to convert to more regenerative ag practices, or, whether they want to go a step further into organic. That's, not going to talk about that today, but I'm a little more unfamiliar with that in Canada. But are there things that maybe the government could do to help incentivize? Because I know in the US, they're incentivizing conventional ag practices that, and a lot of times these chemical companies and whatnot are massive companies that just, have a lot of lobbying power. But,
right.
It's almost like the conventional folks don't necessarily need the subsidies, whereas the ones that are, going the extra mile, like yourself, to do so in a sustainable way, what could be done to, help promote your more sustainable method of ranching and farming?
Well, I think there's a few things. I mean, first of all, I don't think we want to rely on government to provide us with any incentives or things like that. I mean, the way we're looking more towards carbon credits, and that is something that is getting a lot of attention right now, where people are recognizing, well, what is the value of this, and how much carbon is being captured in the native grasslands, for example. And they're taking a look at ways of, capturing those carbon credits and paying the producer for them. So I'm hoping to be on a group that is experimenting with this, and hopefully this will come into fruition. But I think the consumer is really starting to understand some of the ecological benefits that we are supplying, other than just a piece of meat or a steak that's on their plate. That, what's going in there, what we're conserving is, an environment that will have continued wildlife on our ranches. Just to give you an example, our native grasslands, we've lost 70% of our native grasslands in North America to cropland. Of those 70% that we've lost, 70% of the species at risk are also on that environment. So we're losing all this wildlife, diversity, and things like that. And I think the consumer is starting to recognize this and understanding that. So the best way for a consumer to support this would be by top grass beef, basically, because we are stewarding this land for them, and they are getting charged more for it, but it is an ecological service that we are providing everybody in society by, managing our soils so that we have continued good soils for generations to come.
Exactly. No, that's really interesting on the carbon credit front, and I can definitely see that. And I do think that a market solution is always better than a government solution,
Yeah.
when possible. So,
I would sure like to see. I sure would like to see something that stated that we cannot till up any of these grasslands anymore. But there are other groups out there. I just saw the other day where that the Nature Conservancy just received a $25 million grant from the Weston Group to put into 5 different organizations to help conserve all this ranch land. So there's becoming more and more, and I hope that it continues for sure.
Definitely. So with these grasslands, like let's say if a farmer had converted it to cropland, and to slowly turn it back to grasslands, do you have to actually plant those grasslands, or if you give it time and proper amount of natural manure and sunlight and rain, will they come back, or do you have to sort of plant them and plant that seed and then just let that continue to flourish over the years?
Yeah, there is a seed bank that exists down there for thousands of years, where a lot of these native seeds have been, and they can lie dormant for many, many years, and then all of a sudden could come back on their own. So if you did leave that land and you managed it properly by bringing livestock through and trampling it, breaking the crust of the soil so that new seeds can emerge, you eventually will get to the pasture that you're looking for. However, that is a very timely process, and the quickest one would be to seed that back down into perennials of your choice, and then use livestock to further the process faster.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, as a rancher, how do you and your ranching and farming colleagues and friends view sort of this rapid adoption that's taking place amongst consumers, especially almost because of COVID? I think the plant-based trend has accelerated. Do you have farmer friends that are viewing this as an opportunity that maybe traditionally had more of a, we're running more cattle and more of a ranch style operation, that are now saying, I want to start growing yellow peas? Or is there hesitancy, like from, in your community of colleagues, what's sort of the sentiment towards, because I know in the US where, a lot of these, Canada has some great brands as well, Tomorrow Foods, different ones that are doing great plant-based products. But in the US, we've got a few bigger ones, the Beyond Meats, the Impossible Foods. I believe that a large portion of the pea protein that they're using is actually grown in Canada. So I'm curious what sort of actually the chatter amongst farmers and ranchers in, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, where a lot of, sort of Canada's heartland of farming, what the chatter is.
Right. Well, I don't know if I can speak for all of them, but there's a good portion of them are, well, perplexed to say the least, especially as it relates to any of these plant proteins that are looking to replace meat. These are farmers and ranchers that raise crops, which they believe are good, and they also raise cattle. Some of them raise cattle. And then there's lots of just individual farms, and then there's just lots of individual ranchers and that kind of stuff. But I think people are really perplexed at, how this is taking off and really why it's growing. I mean, I think most of us are under the premise that this is all based on, reducing our carbon footprint and that. But yet you grow a lot of these plants, like the peas in Canada, and tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that a lot of these ingredients, are growing up here, but then they're shipped off to different locations far away as China to get manufactured and then shipped back, and multiple ingredient decks, in there. You look at the ingredient deck and the nutritional panel, and you can't even pronounce any of the ingredients on this stuff. It looks like a chemistry set. So I think a lot of producers are just perplexed as to what's really driving this market, as to whether it's sustainable or not. Some of them view it as an opportunity to grow more peas because I don't know if you've noticed, but like commodity pricing on so many of the grains have just gone through the roof. And I don't know if it's part of a bigger cycle. I suspect it is, but I think you're right that a lot of this is driven by the plant-based movement, and so whether it has sustainability, I'm not sure, but it definitely has a lot of interest, and people are, their intentions, in my opinion, are in the right place, because everybody wants to go green. Everybody wants to, do a good job for the environment. And if it means eating these kind of foods, then all the better. But, I think if you ask most of the farmers, they're wondering why they get highly processed and put into this different formats, why we don't eat just whole foods to begin with or something similar. I think it would just be healthier and better for the whole environment.
Yeah, there's some really interesting points in there. I think two that stick out. One being a food security piece of Canada. We typically, have grown a lot of the inputs, and then we, like, let's say, different, let's say wheat. We grow a lot of wheat, but we ship it to, say, Italy. It gets turned into pasta, and then we buy it back at a premium. Why aren't we investing into processing to be able to? We grow the food. Why not be able to process it? And some of that comes down to economics of. Canada is a nation of 38 million, whereas the US, is almost 9 or 10 times that size. So there's, and food processing very much is a game of economies of scale. But I think that's something that a light is shining on because of COVID. The other interesting piece is, like you said, the ingredient decks. And there's actually some interesting sort of rivalries among some of the larger plant-based companies. They've one of them particularly took a shot at the other in an advertisement about how they're much more clean label and simple. Every ingredient in their product, the consumer sees and understands because they've eaten that on its own, whereas some of the other companies have a lot of fillers and binders and things that most people have never heard of. So it's an interesting debate, and surely it's far from over. But I guess one other question I would have is, I guess talking about the monocultures, potentially maybe this is just overshadowed because folks that want to purely become plant-based or vegetarian or vegan, sometimes I'm wondering if there's actually a downside of having this huge spike in yellow peas, if that maybe creates a similar problem of you're just monoculturing yellow peas, as opposed to I think they might say, well, this is coming at the expense if there's going to be less cattle harvested. Let's say that's what they might think in their head. But if you're farming and you're not farming it in a sustainable manner, it's like there's kind of a trade-off to everything. And I don't know the answer. But it's an interesting thought of if it's pushing farmers to have to just extract every bit that they can out of their land in an unsustainable way. Seemingly there's got to be a bit of a cost to that type of farming too, than just saying, well, it's coming at the expense of people eating less beef. So I don't know. I'm not one of those folks, but it's an interesting topic.
It's a very complex issue, isn't it? There's no doubt about it. Yeah,
Definitely. Well,
for sure.
Cal, this has been fantastic. I have three final questions for you. So, where can listeners
Okay.
find more about Topgrass beef and the products that you have in the market right now?
Well, I mean, you can check out my website at www.topgrass.ca. You know, it's a pretty detailed website, and it really goes into how we raise our animals and, you know, how we manage our lands and what we look for from our producers and things like that. We've got, you know, TED Talks and different videos on there, just really probably doing a way better job at explaining some of the things that I just talked about here, for your listeners to follow up on and learn a little bit more. But and then there is a page that also illustrates what retailers that consumers can buy. We're getting fairly strong in Western Canada. We're especially in Calgary. We're in a strong market. I mean, we're in the local stores here with like Calgary Co-op, Spud Home Delivery, Blush Lane, Community Natural Foods. But now that's where we basically got our start. And then now we've expanded into Save On Foods that you'll find out in BC and the rest of Western Canada, some Safeways and Sobeys, and a few other independents throughout Western Canada. And we do have a few independents down in Eastern Canada as well. So yeah, check out our website and you can see where we're at.
That's fantastic. So if you're with Spud, then I guess folks, Spud is not only in Alberta. Folks will be able to get your meat through
Yeah,
Spud in other provinces as well.
that's correct. Yeah, we just moved into BC this only about 2 months ago. So
Okay, great.
yeah,
Well, I'm excited to. I mean, I have a lot of family and friends in Calgary that I'm sure will tune in and try your products. I'm excited to try them in BC here. Um, so two final questions. Next one, in terms of when somebody looks at, let's say they buy a piece of steak that's grain fed or grass fed, are there any discernible differences in terms of sort of the marbling or the flavor of the meats between a grass fed, grass finished animal versus, let's say, a grain fed one?
um, yeah, there is. I mean, well, so typically the perception or the experience with most grass-fed beef is that it's a lot leaner than what you're going to find with the grain-fed beef, and ours is to some degree as well. However, you know, I've done a lot of experimentation and really evaluating how, you know, our animals get the forage and the nutritional values that they need, and as a result, you know, by having a really really good diet, we're probably getting a little bit more marbling than you would from, let's say, some beef from Australia or Argentina, where they're more drought prone and things like that. We have the ability to, you know, give our animals these additional forages throughout the wintertime, and that to lean to a better meat quality in that. The second thing is that we've done a lot of work in terms of genetic selection. So what I find is that there's as much difference within a breed as there is between breeds. And what we're really looking for is specific characteristics of the animal that do well under a forage-based diet. And we're using tools like gene markers to identify animals that have a higher probability towards marbling, which in this, you know, has been to the great success of a lot of the grain-fed animals is that they're able to get more marbling within that beef, and it masks a lot of errors that consumers can make cooking it, which you know, by having that extra fat in there, it's a little more juiciness and some, you know, just removes the error of overcooking it and that. So we've really focused on some of those things to, you know, have our meat quality at the very best. But in terms of, you know, nutritional density, I think you're going to find that the grass-fed beef is substantially more nutritionally dense. You know, it's 7 times higher in vitamin A, 4 times higher in vitamin E. Your omega 6 to omega 3 ratio is, you know, more compatible for the diet that most people are wanting nowadays. And the taste, I just don't think you can beat the taste, because, you know, it's a natural diet of these ruminants, of these cattle. They're not under a stressful situation. And so I just think the meat flavor is so much better as well. And yeah, love for people to try our steak and give it a try.
Most definitely. I'm sure they will. So my final question is one that I ask every guest that comes on Food for Thought. You're someone who lives, excuse me, lives and breathes food, largely speaking, all day, every day. What's your favorite way to reconnect with food on a personal level?
Well, I'd have to say just being in nature and particular being on my ranch. I mean, we're all busy. I'm running my business, going out, fixing the fence, doing, all these details. It seems like we're always on the go, but to be able to go sit in the middle of my ranch, just look around and see all the biodiversity and diversity of different plant species and seeing wildlife roam around and in the air, and to watch my cattle grazing contently is peaceful and calming. And as a result, it just gives me a sense of gratitude for all living things and appreciation and respect for the land, the plants, and the animals that we eat. So that's how I connect.
Fantastic. Calvin Raessler is the owner of Top Grass Cattle Company in Drumheller, Alberta, producing sustainable, top quality grass-fed beef. Calvin, thanks so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure.